No medals. Not for you. The words exploded across the chamber, followed by the vicious tear of fabric as the ribbon was yanked from the old Marine's chest. The clasp snapped, the metal dropping with a sharp metallic clatter against the wooden floor. Gasps burst from the rows of seats, the sound of shock colliding with silence. The veteran flinched, but did not resist. His shoulders tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his trembling hand hovered for a moment where the metal had been, now only an empty crease in his jacket. His breath caught in his throat, shallow and uneven. He did not speak. The official who had ripped it free stood towering, her jaw set, her voice cutting through the stillness once more. Do you understand? You do not deserve this honor. Her finger stabbed the air, her voice echoing against the high ceilings. A child in the front row whispered, too loudly, "Why is she yelling at him?" His mother hushed him quickly, her eyes locked on the stage, wide with disbelief. Around the hall, others shifted in their seats, shame heavy on their faces, yet none moved to intervene. The metal glimmered under the lights, abandoned where it had fallen, a symbol not of recognition but of humiliation. Still, the veteran bowed his head faintly, his hands folding in front of him. He stood as though at inspection, silent, steady, his dignity unbroken despite the cruelty. From the back of the hall came the scrape of a chair's legs against the floor, slow, deliberate, louder than the voices that had mocked. Every head turned. The mayor had risen to his feet. He had not planned to speak, but this time, he would not let it stand. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. Edward Langford's name was etched into no monument, carved into no stone. Yet everyone at City Hall had seen him before. For decades, he had returned on this very morning, never asking for notice, never demanding recognition. He arrived before dawn, moving with the slow care of a man nearly 80 years old, his cane tapping against the concrete as he crossed the quiet square. In his free hand, he carried the flag, folded neatly, the fabric pressed flat, its corners sharp, its weight light compared to the years he bore in his shoulders. He never let anyone else carry it. Even as his joints stiffened and his steps shortened, he held to this ritual, lifting the colors with the same discipline that had once carried him through battle. The pole at the corner of the hall stood waiting. Eddie paused before it, steadying his breath. The morning air was cool, damp with the scent of wet stone and grass, the faint hum of traffic distant. He pressed his palm to the metal pole, cool against his skin, and closed his eyes briefly. In the silence, memory flickered. The bark of a sergeant at dawn, the cadence of boots striking dirt in unison, the smell of canvas tents heavy with rain. His chest rose, then fell, as though pulling himself back from another lifetime. With deliberate precision, Eddie unfurled the flag. The fabric whispered as it unfolded, catching the faintest breath of breeze. He attached the clips one by one, his hands trembling but sure, each motion exact, practiced. When he pulled the rope, the pulley squealed faintly, the sound cutting through the empty square. The flag rose, inch by inch, until it caught the wind and snapped open, its colors bold against the pale morning sky. Eddie straightened as much as his back allowed, his hand pressed flat to his brow, fingers tight, his salute sharp despite the stiffness in his wrist. For a moment the frailty of age vanished. He stood not as an old man, but as a Marine still answering roll call. When his hand lowered, he bowed his head briefly, lips moving in silence, words only he and the wind could hear. The ritual ended as it always had. No applause, no announcement. He turned, lifted his cane, and made his way toward the hall steps. His cap rested under his arm, its brim worn smooth by years of touch. His jacket, pressed but frayed at the edges, clung close around his frame. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as though the building itself demanded ceremony in his approach. Inside, the day's ceremony was already stirring. Voices rose faintly, laughter, the shuffle of chairs, the rustle of programs. Eddie's cane tapped steadily on the marble floor as he crossed the threshold, his steps echoing in the chamber. Heads turned briefly toward him, then away again. Whispers followed. "Is he still doing this every year?" one voice murmured. "He looks like he can barely make it up the stairs," another said, hushed but sharp. A soft laugh answered, quick and dismissive. Eddie adjusted his grip on the cane, his shoulders squaring despite the words. He did not answer. He never had. His silence was armor, his discipline older than the voices that mocked. As he moved toward his seat, the official at the podium flipped through papers, her sigh audible even above the murmurs. She glanced briefly at Eddie, then back at her notes, her lips pressing into a thin, impatient line. Eddie lowered himself into a chair with care, his cane resting against his knee. His cap remained in his lap, his fingers brushing its brim slowly, as though aligning it to some invisible order. His eyes rose to the front of the hall, steady and unblinking. He had not come for applause. He had come, as always, to stand when called, to honor the day, to bear witness. But this year, something in the air was different. The tension was sharper, the whispers harsher, the impatience visible in every gesture of the official who would soon call his name. Eddie lifted his chin faintly, the crease of his brow tightening as his hand steadied over the cap in his lap. He did not yet know what awaited, but he would face it, as he always had, with silence, with dignity, with the unbroken line of discipline he carried in his very breath. And when his name was called, the quiet of his ritual would shatter. The chamber's ceiling arched high, its panels gleaming beneath the glow of recessed lights. Rows of chairs stretched neatly in lines, filled with townsfolk and officials who had come for the morning's ceremony. The murmur of voices drifted like a low tide, punctuated now and again by laughter sharp enough to echo against the walls. At the far side, Edward Langford rose slowly from his chair, his hand firm on the cane as he pushed himself upright. His jacket settled around his shoulders, the fabric creased from years of wear, but pressed with care, as if every thread carried weight. He steadied himself, fingers brushing once against the brim of the cap in his lap, before setting it under his arm. His gaze moved to the podium where names would be called. The distance was not far, yet each step would demand strength from knees stiff with age, from a back bent by years of service and time. His chest rose once in a deep, steadying breath. Then he began. The cane struck the marble floor with a steady rhythm. Tap, pause, step. Tap, pause, step. His other hand brushed against the fabric of his trousers with each stride, keeping his posture as tall as his body allowed. The sound carried across the chamber, drawing glances from those near the aisle. A few turned their heads fully, watching the old Marine's slow progress with eyes that flickered between pity and impatience. Whispers stirred behind cupped hands. "It'll take him all morning." The words floated forward, not loud, but clear enough. Another voice, sharper, followed. "Why bother with him? There are younger men here who served just as well." A muffled chuckle answered, swallowed quickly when Eddie passed. He did not react. His jaw set faintly, his lips pressed thin, but his gaze remained fixed forward. He had heard such things before, long ago, in quieter tones whispered behind him as he walked with his cane through grocery aisles or down church steps. His silence was not surrender. It was discipline. He pressed forward, step by deliberate step. At the front, the official organizing the ceremony shifted impatiently. Papers shuffled with exaggerated noise as she scanned the list, her sigh cutting across the chamber. She glanced up, eyes narrowing as Eddie drew closer, then back down again, tapping the microphone as if urging the program to move faster. Her movements lacked subtlety. The message was clear. Eddie paused midway, his breath catching. He gripped the cane tighter, steadying himself. For a moment, his vision blurred with the effort, the faces in the rows on either side dimming. He closed his eyes briefly, memory stirring. Mud slicked beneath boots, the sound of shouted orders above the crack of rifle fire, the sharp smell of smoke. He exhaled, opened his eyes. and pressed forward. A boy in the front row leaned forward, his wide eyes fixed on the veteran's cane. "Why does he walk like that?" he asked softly. His father shushed him, whispering something too low to carry. Eddie's gaze flicked toward the child for only a moment, his expression softening faintly before he returned it to the path ahead. When he reached the first step of the dais, he paused again. His knee bent slowly, painfully, as he lifted himself upward. The cane clicked against the edge of the step, his shoulders bowing under the strain. The silence stretched as those nearest held their breath, waiting for him to falter. He did not. With deliberate strength he climbed, then straightened as much as his back would allow. At the podium, the official shifted again, her lips curving faintly with irritation. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice flat and clipped. "Edward Langford." The name fell without warmth, without recognition, as though the syllables themselves were a burden to be spoken. The room hushed faintly. Every head turned toward him now, expectation heavy, judgment thicker still. Eddie adjusted the cap beneath his arm, his hand smoothing once across the front of his jacket. His cane steadied him as he stepped forward. Still, he said nothing. The podium loomed tall before Edward Langford, its polished wood gleaming under the chamber lights. The microphone stood angled slightly downward, waiting, though no words from him were requested. Behind the stand, the official rifled through her notes one final time, her sigh heavy, her gaze fixed downward until the last moment. Then, without looking him in the eye, she gestured sharply to the metal case beside her. An aide stepped forward, holding the small velvet box as though it were an inconvenience. The official snapped it open, the bronze metal catching the light with a warm glimmer. She lifted it carelessly, her fingers gripping the ribbon, and turned toward Eddie with a thin, impatient smile. "Edward Langford," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying no reverence, only procedure. "Presented for service rendered decades ago." The words lacked weight, stripped of dignity, tossed into the air as though they mattered little. Eddie bowed his head faintly, his cane pressing firm against the floor as he steadied himself. His hand rose slowly, trembling, to meet the metal as it was pinned to his jacket. His lips parted, the faintest whisper escaping. "Thank you." It was soft, meant not for applause, but for the memory of those who had not lived to hear their names spoken. The metal rested against his chest for only a breath. Then it was gone. The official's hand shot forward, gripping the ribbon at its base. With a sudden yank, she tore it free, the clasp snapping against the fabric of his jacket. The metal fell, striking the wooden stage with a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the chamber. Gasps rippled from the audience, sharp and quick, followed by silence so deep it pressed against the walls. Her voice rose, sharper now, carrying over the stunned stillness. "Not for you! You don't deserve this honor!" The words cut through the hall, each syllable deliberate, each one a blow delivered not just to Eddie, but to the generations who had worn the same uniform. A murmur stirred in the front row. A woman leaned forward, her eyes wide, her voice trembling as she called out, "Please, stop, he's done nothing wrong." The official spun toward her, eyes narrowing, voice like a whip. "Sit down. This does not concern you." The woman recoiled, her protest stifled by the command. The metal lay between them on the floor, its bronze surface glinting under the lights, abandoned like refuse. Eddie did not bend to reach for it. He stood still, his cane steady, his shoulders squared as much as age would allow. His lips pressed thin, his breath shallow, but his silence held. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers spreading like ripples on water. "Why would she do that? He's an old man." A child's voice carried above the murmurs, unfiltered by restraint. "Why is she yelling at him?" The question hung in the air, heavier than accusation, silencing even the whispers. The official's jaw tightened. She straightened, her eyes sweeping across the audience, daring any further objection. Then she turned back to Eddie, her voice cold, clipped. "You will stand aside. Do not waste our time." Eddie lowered his head faintly, his hands folding before him. His fingers curled tight against one another, knuckles whitening, but his shoulders did not sag. He did not bow beneath the weight of her words. He did not plead, did not protest. He stood as he always had, silent, unflinching, the dignity in his composure sharper than any insult could strike. And still, the old Marine did not flinch. The chamber remained hushed, the weight of the insult lingering in the still air. The metal glimmered faintly on the floor between them, untouched, as though daring someone to claim it. All eyes had turned toward the old man who stood with his shoulders squared, his cane anchoring him in place. Edward Langford did not bend to retrieve the medal. Instead, he drew a slow breath, his chest rising with a quiet strength that belied his years. His hand lifted not to his tormentor, not to the crowd, but to the front of his jacket. He smoothed the fabric gently, as if realigning what had been disturbed. Each motion was deliberate, precise, carrying the weight of habit forged long ago in uniform. He adjusted the collar, pulling it straight, his fingers trembling but sure. He brushed once across the front, flattening the crease left by the torn ribbon. Then, with the same unbroken rhythm, he lowered his hand to rest flat against his chest, exactly where the medal had been pinned. The gesture was quiet, but it carried more dignity than the award itself. For a moment he closed his eyes. In that brief silence, memory flickered behind the weathered lids. The shouted cadence of drill instructors, the barked commands at dawn, the silent discipline of men who stood unshaken under fire. His breath steadied, the tension in his shoulders easing into composure. When his eyes opened again, they were clear, steady, forward. Slowly, Edward turned toward the audience. He did not speak, yet he bowed his head faintly, the motion sharp with restraint. It was not apology. It was acknowledgement. A nod to those who sat before him, to those who understood without words. The discipline of decades still lived in the smallness of that gesture. The crowd, unsettled moments before, quieted further. No one moved. No one laughed. A hush spread deeper than before, born not of shock now, but of recognition. The silence carried the weight of respect, unspoken but undeniable. The official at the podium stiffened, her lips pressed thin as though the composure in his silence only deepened her frustration. She shuffled her papers again, the sound harsh in the stillness, her voice preparing to call the next name. But the crowd's attention had already shifted, no longer hers to command. Edward stood straighter than his years should have allowed. His cane remained steady, his hand still resting flat against his chest. Though the medal was gone, the man himself was unbroken. His dignity filled the chamber in a way no ceremony could replicate. And from the back of the hall, one figure had not taken his eyes away. His gaze followed every motion, every quiet gesture. His jaw tightened, his hand stilled on the armrest of his chair. The mayor had been watching. At the very back of the chamber, apart from the clusters of murmuring council members and staff, the mayor sat with his hands resting on the arms of his chair. His posture was upright, his suit pressed immaculate, his tie drawn tight against the collar. From a distance, he appeared the picture of composure, another official present only to observe. But those who looked closer might have seen the tautness in his jaw, the faint rhythm of his finger tapping once, then again, against the wood. His eyes had not left Edward Langford since the moment the medal was torn away. They followed every deliberate motion, the straightening of the jacket, the smoothing of the collar, the quiet bow of acknowledgement to the crowd. Each gesture sharpened the line between insult and dignity, between cruelty and discipline. And with every passing second, the mayor's stillness grew heavier. The chamber's air pressed down, thick with unease. Council aides at the mayor's side leaned toward him, whispering quietly, "Sir, perhaps it's best to let the program continue." Another added, "Don't involve yourself. It will pass." The mayor did not answer. His gaze remained locked on the old Marine, unblinking, the weight of memory stirring behind his eyes. For him, the scene was not distant. It was not abstract. The sight of an old soldier standing silent against humiliation touched something deeper than the trappings of office. He had seen that silence before, on long marches, in muddy camps, in the eyes of men who carried more than they spoke. His throat tightened as the echoes rose, as though the air itself carried the cadence of boots striking ground, of whispered prayers in darkness. The aide shifted again, nervously adjusting his papers. "Sir?" he began, but the mayor raised one hand, silencing him without turning. The tapping of his fingers ceased. His knuckles tightened faintly against the armrest instead, the pressure whitening his skin. His silence was not consent. It was the gathering of something heavier, a storm building behind restraint. On the stage, the official continued her performance, shuffling notes with a sharp snap of paper, her irritation plain for all to see. She leaned into the microphone, her tone clipped. "We have wasted enough time. Next name now." The words fell like stones into the quiet hall. Gasps stirred faintly, the unease thickening once more. Edward did not move, his hand still pressed against his chest where the medal had been. The official's voice rose sharper still, her command now edged with cruelty. "Step aside, old man. You've had your moment." The mayor's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. His hand stilled entirely on the armrest. He had not planned to intervene. He had not come to speak, but the insult had cut too deep. The official's voice cracked sharp against the chamber's hush, the words brittle with impatience. "Step aside, old man. You've held us long enough." She jabbed a finger toward the edge of the stage, her tone more suited to a reprimand than an honor. Gasps swept through the rows, heads turning, discomfort shifting from seat to seat. Yet still no one rose, no one spoke. The silence of the hall deepened into complicity. Edward Langford did not move. His cane pressed steady against the floor, his shoulders squared though bent with age. His gaze remained fixed forward, calm, his hand still resting flat over the place where the medal had been torn away. The humiliation hung heavy, but he bore it without word or protest, his stillness itself a defiance greater than any shouted reply. The audience stirred, whispers breaking once more like cracks in ice. "She's gone too far," one voice breathed. Another, lower, muttered, "Why doesn't someone stop this?" But the words did not rise above the level of fear. All eyes flickered toward the back, toward the one figure whose silence had not yet been broken. The mayor's hand stilled on the armrest, his jaw locked tight, his breath deepening, his eyes narrowing with resolve. For a heartbeat, he remained seated, his body taut with restraint. Then, with a motion as deliberate as any command, he pushed himself upward. The sound came first, the scrape of his chair's legs against the polished floor, sharp and echoing in the chamber's quiet. It carried farther than it should have, louder than the official's voice, silencing whispers mid-breath. Heads snapped toward the back, eyes widening, mouths falling shut. He stood tall, his suit coat falling straight along his frame, his presence filling the rear of the chamber. The aides at his side froze, their whispers cut short, their eyes darting nervously between him and the stage. But the mayor's gaze did not shift. It remained locked on the old Marine at the podium, steady, unyielding. His first step forward struck the floor with a measured weight, the sound carrying in the stillness. Then another, each stride deliberate, each one announcing itself like the steady beat of a drum. The murmurs of the crowd dissolved entirely, leaving only the rhythm of his approach, the echo of leather soles on marble. When he reached the aisle's center, he halted. His chin lifted faintly, his voice rising firm, resonant, cutting through the chamber with clarity no microphone could match. "No, we will not move on." The words struck like a command, reverberating through the hall, stripping the official's voice of all authority. Gasps flared again, louder this time, the shock rolling through the crowd. The hall fell completely silent. The mayor's words still lingered in the air, their echo pressing into every corner of the chamber. "No, we will not move on." His voice had cut the silence clean, severing the ceremony's cold rhythm. For a moment, no one breathed. The official stood frozen behind the podium, her lips parted, her papers trembling faintly in her hands. The audience sat rigid, eyes wide, caught between shame and awe. The mayor stepped forward again, each stride deliberate, steady, his presence carrying the weight of authority and something deeper still. The sound of his shoes against the marble rang louder than before, each step striking the hall with measured intent. No one spoke, no one shifted. Even the children sat still, their wide eyes tracking his approach. He reached the base of the dais and halted. For a long heartbeat, he said nothing. His gaze lowered, not to the official, not to the crowd, but to the small bronze medal lying abandoned on the floorboards. Its ribbon twisted, its face catching the light. It gleamed not as a decoration, but as a wound. Slowly, the mayor bent. His hand reached down, fingers closing around the medal with care, lifting it as though retrieving something sacred from the dust. He rose again, the medal glinting between his fingers, and turned toward the man who still stood tall, despite the humiliation he had endured. Edward Langford's eyes followed the movement. His chest rose with a slow, trembling breath, his shoulders straightening as much as his age allowed. His hand remained pressed to the place on his jacket where the medal had once rested. The mayor stepped closer, his face solemn, his gaze unwavering. He did not extend the medal in casual offering. Instead, he raised it to chest height, pausing for a moment in silence before reaching forward. With deliberate precision, he pinned it back onto Edward's jacket, his fingers careful, his motions reverent. The click of the clasp locking in place carried through the still chamber, louder than it should have been. When it was done, the mayor stepped back half a pace, his hands falling to his sides, his chin lifting in acknowledgement. Edward's lips parted slightly, his breath hitching. His eyes glistened, the sheen of memory and recognition rising unbidden. He did not speak. He did not need to. Instead, he lowered his head in a faint, solemn nod. For that moment, nothing else existed. Not the official, not the audience, not the weight of shame or insult. Only two men, bound by silence, by respect, by a brotherhood older than ceremony. The recognition passed between them without a single word. The room felt it too. The audience shifted, but not in discomfort now. A hush of reverence swept across the rows. Even those who had whispered mockery before bowed their heads, compelled by the stillness that filled the air. The official behind the podium froze, her authority unraveling with every heartbeat of silence. Edward stood with the medal once more pinned to his chest, his hand rising to brush against it gently. His fingers lingered over the bronze, trembling but sure, as though grounding himself in the truth it represented. His lips curved faintly, not in a smile but in something deeper. Recognition, belonging, peace. The mayor's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in resolve. He turned his head slightly, his voice lowering, though it carried still through the chamber. And then he asked a question only a soldier could answer. The mayor's eyes held fast to Edward Langford, the silence between them carrying more than words could bear. Then his voice came, steady, but softened with memory, carrying into every corner of the chamber. "Do you remember Hugh City?" His question fell into the stillness like a stone into water, its ripples undeniable. Eddie's breath caught. His eyes closed for a moment, lids trembling as though bracing against a storm of memory long held at bay. When they opened, the chamber was gone for him. He was elsewhere. The thick air of Vietnam, the acrid burn of smoke, the distant crack of rifles and the whistle of mortars. His lips moved, voice low, ragged. "The mud was red clay," he whispered, each word pulling weight from deep within him. Like rust, it clung to our boots. We carried each other through it. His hand pressed firmer against the metal, his fingers curling faintly as though gripping the straps of a pack, the arm of a fallen brother, the weight of another life in his hands. Gasps stirred in the crowd, sharp and unrestrained. The name of that battle was etched in history, in textbooks, in memories passed down. Hugh City, a place where fire and fury consumed young men, where survival itself was an act of endurance. The truth of it rolled through the chamber, shaking the ground beneath ceremony and pretense. The mayor stepped closer, his voice lifting, the calm iron of command threading through it. "This man saved lives," he declared, turning his face toward the crowd. "Many lives, including men who still walk among us today." His hand rose faintly, gesturing toward the medal he had just restored. "That piece of bronze does not tell his story. His actions do." The audience shifted, their expressions breaking beneath the weight of revelation. The whispers of doubt, of dismissal, of mockery dissolved in an instant, stripped bare by truth. A woman pressed a hand to her chest, tears welling. A man beside her lowered his head, guilt etching into his features. Even the child in the front row sat rigid, his small eyes wide, his hands clutching his knees as though holding fast to something he could not yet name. Eddie drew another trembling breath. His voice came again, softer now, more fragile but no less sharp. "We were boys," he said, the words breaking as his throat caught. "Just boys. But we held the line." His eyes glistened, the years collapsing in an instant. He was there again, not a frail man at a podium, but a Marine among Marines, his resolve forged in the fire of Hugh. The mayor inclined his head, his eyes steady, his jaw set. He spoke not with ceremony but with the reverence of one who had seen the cost. "And we live because you did." The official behind the podium stumbled backward half a step, her papers slipping from her hands. The flutter of pages across the floor carried louder than her silence. Her face drained of color, her lips parted, but no sound came. The authority she wielded moments ago dissolved into shame. Her presence diminished under the weight of truth she could not contest. The crowd could not look away. The hush was absolute, the chamber itself seeming to hold its breath. Eyes fixed on the old Marine at the podium, shoulders squared, his medal restored. Respect swelled in the silence, respect born not from pity, but from revelation. And the men and women who had mocked him could no longer lift their eyes. The chamber held still, as though even the walls had paused to listen. The mayor's words lingered, each syllable carrying the weight of truth, the echo of lives preserved by Edward Langford's steady courage. No one dared to break the silence. The only sound was the faint creak of the flag outside, stirred by the morning wind beyond the windows. The mayor turned from Eddie to face the hall. His voice rose once more, steady, resonant, stripped of politics and pretense. "This man saved lives. Not one, not two, many. He carried others when they could not walk. He stood when the line threatened to break. And because of him, men who would have been buried in red clay came home." His eyes swept the crowd, locking with face after face. "If that does not deserve honor, what does?" The words settled heavy into the hearts of those gathered. Slowly, almost hesitantly, a man in the front row pushed himself to his feet. His head bowed, his hand pressed to his chest. Another rose behind him, then another. In moments, the entire audience was standing, rows upon rows of men, women, and children, rising not with applause, not with noise, but with silence deeper than any ovation. The air thickened with reverence, the kind born not of command, but of awakening. Edward Langford stood at the podium, his hand still resting against the medal, his breath unsteady. His eyes glistened as he looked across the chamber, his lips trembling, but still he did not speak. His silence was enough. Behind him, the official who had humiliated him shrank further into herself. Her hands shook as she stooped to gather the papers scattered across the floor. She did not look up. The authority she once wielded had evaporated. She was no longer seen. The eyes of the hall belonged to Eddie now. The mayor stepped to Edward's side. He did not offer his arm as pity, but as recognition. His hand rested briefly on Eddie's shoulder, steady, affirming. Then, with quiet authority, he gestured toward the aisle. "Walk with me." Together, they stepped from the podium. The metal glinted faintly against Eddie's jacket as he descended the steps, his cane clicking softly against the wood. The crowd parted as they passed, the rows widening to make way, heads bowing as the two men moved down the center. The silence was unbroken, but it was no longer cold. It was reverence itself, the kind of silence that acknowledged sacrifice, that recognized dignity, that honored what words could not contain. Children clutched their parents' hands, watching with wide eyes. Mothers wept softly. Fathers lowered their caps. At the far end of the hall, the mayor halted. He turned once more to the crowd, his voice low but firm. From this day forward, when a veteran stands in this hall, they will not stand alone. Not in silence, not in shame. They will be honored. Gasps of emotion stirred again, but no applause followed. Only the sound of every head bowing in unison, the weight of a promise forming in the chamber. Edward lifted his chin faintly, his breath catching as his eyes swept across the sea of bowed heads. For the first time that morning, the humiliation he had endured no longer pressed heavy on his shoulders. In its place rose something else, belonging, recognition, peace. But what began in that hall would not end there. 1 year later, the square before City Hall stirred with the same early light that had witnessed Edward Langford's ritual for decades. The flagpole still rose tall at the corner, the rope whispering against the metal as the breeze caught it. This time, Eddie did not stand alone in the cool morning air. A small gathering had formed. Marines in uniform, veterans in plain clothes, townsfolk who had remembered. All stood in silence as Eddie, his cap under his arm and the folded flag in his hand, made his way across the stone path. His cane tapped against the ground with the same measured rhythm. Yet there was no impatience in the faces watching him now. Every eye was fixed on him, not with pity, but with reverence. When he reached the pole, he did as he always had. He clipped the fabric with careful precision, his trembling hands steady in their discipline. The flag rose inch by inch, and as it unfurled against the pale sky, every head bowed. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, alive with respect. When Eddie turned toward the chamber, he found the mayor waiting at the base of the steps. This time, he did not climb them alone. The mayor stepped forward, offering his arm not as assistance, but as honor. Eddie rested his hand lightly, allowing himself to be guided inside. Together they entered the hall that had once echoed with cruelty. The chamber was filled again, the crowd assembled for the ceremony. But now, the atmosphere was different. Where whispers had once carried doubt, quiet anticipation reigned. The official who had mocked him no longer stood at the podium. Her absence was as complete as her silence had been a year before. Instead, the mayor addressed the hall with a voice strong and clear. Last year, we failed a man who had given more than we could ever repay. From that day forward, this ceremony has changed. From this day forward, the first honor belongs not to the living officials, but to those who bore the weight before us. His eyes turned toward Eddie. Today, Edward Langford will present the first medal. A murmur swept through the crowd, not of doubt, but of awe. Eddie's breath trembled as he stepped forward, guided to the podium where the medal waited in its box. His fingers closed around it, the weight light compared to the years he had carried. He turned, his gaze falling upon a younger veteran standing ready, shoulders squared, eyes bright with the same fire Eddie had once borne. Eddie lifted the medal carefully, his hand steady, and pinned it against the younger man's chest, with the same deliberate precision the mayor had shown him. His lips did not part with words. His silence spoke louder. The recognition of one soldier to another, the passing of honor from generation to generation. The chamber rose again, every person standing, the weight of tradition born in that moment. No applause broke the stillness, only silence, rich, reverent, binding. Eddie stepped back, his hand brushing against the medal still pinned to his own chest, his eyes glistening with quiet peace. For the first time, he no longer carried his ritual alone. It had become theirs as well. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we will walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.